I'm Rebecca from Rebecca Jane Patterns, and today I'm going to be showing you how to make the Avelina Dress Sewing Pattern. This sewing pattern is good for advanced beginners. I'd say the most difficult parts will be the gathers around the waist, the princess seams and the invisible zipper. Another thing I want to mention is this pattern has been drafted with a B cup. So if your bust measurement or cup size exceeds this, then you will need to perform an FBA, which is a full bust adjustment, which simply put is adding more volume at the princess seams so it shapes around your chest properly. And then you'll need to add some length here. This basically means you've got to adjust the pattern and break it apart. But in the instructions, I include how to do this on the digital drawings, and I also include it in this tutorial today if you prefer video instructions. It sounds a lot more daunting than it is, and I promise you it's super simple. This sewing pattern has been created in size 4 to 34. I will add the body measurements on the screen now for you to take a look at those, and I will now show you the Avelina dress up close. So here you can see at the top of the sleeve head we've got some really cute gathers going on. This waist tie here that goes around the waistline is optional. You don't have to have this. This just adds an extra tailored look to the dress. As you can see here, we've got the princess seams, which adds some really nice shape at the bust, and then it will go in here and fit really nicely. And then we've got some gathers at the waist, which continue on at the back of the dress. We also have a centre back seam here, which I think is really pretty. And then you have the princess seams at the back to add that extra fitted look. This dress is full length. I am 5'7" or 170 centimeters for reference, and I have made the Avelina dress in a size 10 for reference as well. If you want to purchase this sewing pattern, I'm going to pop the link to my Etsy shop and also the link to the listing down below so you can take a further look at that. But for now, let's get into the step-by-step tutorial for the Avelina dress. I really hope you enjoy it, and let me know if you have any questions. You can message me via email, Instagram or Etsy. This section of the video is going to be covering how to apply a full bust adjustment to the princess seams of the pattern. Just remember, if your bust measurement exceeds a B cup, perform a full bust adjustment. On the side front bodice, draw in the 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance around the front panel seam and partially around the arm sky seam. Remember to remark the notches at the edge of the front panel seam. Next, you'll need to mark in 3 different lines. Line 1 goes across the bust apex, which is already drawn on the pattern. Line 2 will go from the apex to the waist seam, and line 3 will go from the apex to the arm sky corner. Start cutting from line 2 at the waist seam all the way up to the end of line 3, leaving a hinge of 0.5 centimeters or 0.2 inches. The hinge is used to swing this section of the pattern outwards while still being connected to the rest of the side front bodice. Starting at the side seam, cut through line 1, leaving a hinge of 0.5 centimeters or 0.2 inches at the bust apex. Lay your side front bodice on a fresh sheet of paper and mark down sections A, B and C. Grab some tape and tape down section A at the arm sky and the bust apex or line 1. Now it's time to add the additional width you need for your cup size. Move section B outwards by the additional width needed. Since we're only adjusting one side of the pattern, add half the difference between a B cup and your own cup size. As you move section B outwards, make sure line 2 and the inner line of section B are parallel to one another. In other words, the lines lay side by side, having the same distance continuously between them. Once you have the sections positioned correctly, tape them in place. After I've taped the sections in place, I'm just going back and making sure my FBA width is still accurate. Draw a line across the lower area of section B. Use your scissors to cut through this line as we're going to drag this part down and align it with the waist seam. Slide the bottom section B down to align with the bottom of section C. Before taping this piece down, make sure it is still the original FBA gap that you need. Measure the vertical gap created and make a note of it. Label this section Gap 1. Place a fresh sheet of paper over your pattern piece. Trace around the new side front bodice piece, marking in Gap 1, all notches, the bust dart and the new bust apex. Remember to take your time with this and to lift the paper up if you're not sure if you're putting the notches in the right place. Alternatively, you can use some tracing paper if you find this easier. Cut into the pattern at the front panel seam and on the bottom dart leg. Leave a hinge at the bust apex that amounts to 0.5 centimeters or 0.2 inches. Next, cut off the excess paper around the pattern piece. Here you can see I'm just rewriting my Gap 1 measurement. Now we need to close the dart by swinging section B upwards. This will create a new opening at the front panel seam. This is Gap 2. Once the dart's been closed, use some tape to secure it into place. Place a small sheet of paper behind Gap 2 and tape it in place. Then you can smooth off the curve on the front panel seam. Trim off any excess paper. Measure the distance of Gap 2 and make a note of it on your pattern. Now we need to add both Gap 1 and Gap 2 measurements to the front bodice. To do this, we'll need to measure two distances. Distance A is from the bottom of the pattern piece at the waistline to the bottom of Gap 1. Distance B is the top of Gap 1 to the bottom of Gap 2. Measure distance A and distance B and make a note of them on your pattern. Using the measurements from the last step, mark distance A from the bottom of the front bodice and then mark distance B starting from the point of distance A. So the first line should be distance A, and that's from the bottom of the pattern piece to where I'm marking now. Measure distance B and apply it to the pattern starting from the line you've just drawn. Now it's time to cut through both these lines. Place a sheet of paper behind the front bodice and tape the top section of the bodice in place. Move the two sections apart, creating a gap that is equal to the size of gap 2. Move the bottom section of the front bodice downwards to be equal to the measurement of gap 1. The extra length we've added to the side front bodice for the FBA has now been applied to the front bodice. All that's left to do now is cut around and take off any excess paper. The FBA is now complete, and I do recommend to make a toile or a muslin just to make sure that it fits your cup size. Once you've cut out your paper pattern, now it's time to cut it out in the fabric. You can find the fabric width you're using and the size you're using, and use the fabric lay plans on the instructions to use your fabric efficiently. As you cut out each pattern piece, remember to cut it in to all the notches. If your fabric's on the thinner side, consider adding a stay stitch at the armholes and the neckline. This just stops the distortion of the curves as you're constructing the dress. Stitch the lining back bodices together at the centre back with the right sides together and a 1 cm or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Head over to your ironing board and press the seams open. Make sure to press the seam well on the wrong side of the fabric and also the right side of the fabric. Repeat this process for the main fabric back bodices. Now it's time to construct the princess seams. The side front bodice pieces need to be connected to the front bodice. Stitch with the right sides together using a 1 cm or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. It's really important to match up the notches accurately so that the fabric is distributed evenly. Princess seams require some gentle easing to get the fabric to fit the curve of the body just right. If you find it helps, use some pins to keep the fabric positioned. As you can see in the video, I'm using the side front bodice to walk it down the front bodice curve. This is just to give you a visual of how the two pieces go together. I'm now attaching the front bodice to the side front bodice with a 1 cm or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance and the right sides together. If you find your fabric is thick or slippery, you can also use a walking foot, as it can help manage the layers more evenly. Once you finish stitching your princess seams, head over to your ironing board and press the seams open. Clip into the curves of the seam allowance, as this creates a smoother finish. Turn the bodice with the right sides facing you and press the seams again. The previous steps will need to be applied to the main fabric bodice and also the lining bodice. Now it's time to attach the side back bodice to the back bodices. Stitch together with a 1 cm or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance with the right sides together, and again making sure to match up the notches accurately. Press the seams open and then clip into the curves again, as we did for the front princess seams. Turn the fabric to the right side and press the seams again. Pin the main fabric, front and back bodices together at the shoulders and side seams, with the right sides facing each other. Leave a 6 cm or 2.3 inch gap on the right side seam of the main bodice, as this is where the invisible zip will be placed later on. Head back over to your ironing board and press all the seams open. Overlock each side of the 6 cm or 2.3 inch opening that we left on the main fabric bodice. If you don't have an overlocker or a serger, just use a zigzag stitch on your sewing machine. Repeat this process for your lining bodice pieces, except this time leave the gap opening on the left side seam of the bodice. Place the lining bodice and main fabric bodice on top of one another with the right sides together. Stitch at the neckline with a 1 cm or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Place the shoulder seams open and flat, align them carefully when joining the bodices. I like to use pins when I'm stitching my neckline, just so I know the fabric is positioned correctly. I normally start pinning from the shoulder seam so I know everything is where it should be. Before you start stitching the neckline, I find it helps to measure out your 1 cm or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. You can use this as a guide when you're stitching around the curves of the neckline. Press the seams open and then close them again, as in the next step we'll be applying an understitch. Turn the bodice to the right side and press the neckline seam again. Now that the main fabric bodice and lining bodice are combined, we're going to be applying an understitch to the neckline. An understitch is a helpful technique used in sewing to keep linings from falling out or rolling out while the garment is being worn. When creating an understitch, you'll need to make sure that the seam allowance is continuously lying towards the lining bodice. Understitch the neckline 0.3 centimetres or 1/8 of an inch from the neckline seam created in step 3. Keeping the seam allowance positioned behind the stitch line continuously. Once you finish understitching, head over to your ironing board and press the neckline seam again. Stitch the right sides of each sleeve together with a 1 centimetre or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Press the seam open on the wrong side of the fabric and then turn the sleeve to the right side and press again on the right side of the fabric. Once you finish pressing, overlock or zigzag stitch the seam. Before you apply the step to your second sleeve, use some tailor's chalk or a fabric pen to mark on which side of the sleeve is the front sleeve, as you want to create a pair of mirrored sleeves. This will also be helpful later when we're connecting the front sleeve to the front bodice and the back of the sleeve to the back bodice. Next, fold the raw edge of the sleeve up by 0.5 centimetres or 1/4 of an inch and press in place. Fold the cuff of the sleeve again by another 1.5 centimetres or 0.6 inches and press in place. Stitch 0.3 centimetres or 1/8 of an inch from the folded edge. Leave a 2 centimetre or 0.7 inch gap to feed the elastic through. Measure around your arm approximately 4 inches above your elbow and add 1 centimetre or 3/8 of an inch. Then cut 2 pieces of elastic to match this length. Attach a safety pin to one end of the elastic to feed it through the tunnel. Make sure the other end of the elastic doesn't enter the tunnel. Join the ends of the elastic together. Go over the stitches a few times to reinforce it in place. Slide the ends of the elastic inside the tunnel and stitch the gap closed. Create 2 gather stitches in between the 2 sleeve gather notches as shown on the pattern. Before you start stitching, change your stitch length to 4.5. Leave a long line of excess thread before you start stitching, as these will be used to gather the sleeve head later on. And also remember not to backstitch, as this won't allow you to be able to gather the sleeve. As shown in the video, I've already sewn the first line of gathering stitches. Now I'll sew a second line of gathering stitches parallel to the first. Pull on the loose threads to gather the sleeve head. If you find the gathers unravel themselves, use some pins to keep them positioned. Now it's time to attach the sleeves to the bodice. Remember to use the mark made earlier on the front of the sleeve to match it up with the front bodice. All sleeve gather notches need to line up with the sleeve notches closest to the shoulder seam on the front and back bodice. Align the lower sleeve notches at the arms guy with the second set of notches on the sleeve. Attach both sleeves to the bodice with the right sides together and a 1 cm or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Open the seams and press them flat, then press the seams closed. Turn the bodice with the right sides facing out and press the seams again. Overlock or zigzag stitch the sleeve seams. Overlock or zigzag stitch around each raw edge of the pocket bags. Before using the pattern pieces for the skirts, make sure all the notches have been marked. Before overlocking each side seam of the skirts, use tailor's chalk or fabric pen to mark where the pocket notch is. The overlocked edge will make this hard to see. With the right sides together, place 1 pocket bag at each pocket notch on the front and back skirt. Attach the straight edge of the pocket bag to the skirt with a 1 cm or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Press the seams open and then closed. Turn the skirt with the right sides facing you and press the seams again. Turn the pockets and skirt with the right sides facing you. Create an edge stitch, making sure to catch the seam allowance behind the pocket bag. This will prevent the pocket from drooping out when wearing the dress. Apply the step to all 4 pockets. Apply the edge stitch with a 0.3 cm or 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. Place the back skirt on top of the front skirt, right sides together. Sew each side seam, sewing around the edge of the pockets and right down to the hem, using a 1 cm or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. On the right side of the skirt, start the stitch line 2 cm or 0.7 inches above the pocket bag. The invisible zip will be placed here later on. On the left side of the skirt, start the stitch line at the waist of the skirt, travelling down around the pocket bag all the way down to the hem. Continue to use a 1 cm or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Press the side seams of the skirt and the pocket bag seams open and then closed. Turn the skirt with the right sides facing you and press the seams again. Create 2 gathering stitches parallel to one another around the entire waist of the skirt. Remember, as we did for the sleeve, leave a long line of excess threads and remember not to backstitch. Use tailor's chalk or a fabric pen to make a small mark on the wrong side of the back skirt. This will help later on to make sure you're aligning the back bodice with the back skirt, as once both the front skirt and the back skirt are gathered, it's hard to identify which is which. Pull on the loose threads to gather the fabric at the waist. Make sure the gathers are distributed evenly. Now it's time to attach the skirt to the bodice. Make sure you're attaching the back skirt to the back bodice and the front skirt to the front bodice. Turn the bodice inside out and push the waist of the skirt through the neckline of the bodice. Attach the bodice to the skirt with the right sides together and a 1 cm or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Ensure the waist seam of the bodice and the skirt align fully to the end without folding in the seam allowance at either the skirt or the bodice. Keep the gap open at the side seam for the invisible zip in the following step. Remember to line up the notches on the front and back skirt with the princess seams at the bodice, and to distribute the gathers proportionately between the notches. It's also important to line up the side seams of the front and back skirt with the side seams at the bodice. Before stitching the skirt and the bodice together, pull the bodice up to reveal the right side of the fabric and make sure that the gathers are distributed proportionately. Stitch the skirt to the bodice with a 1 cm or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Press the waist seam open and then closed. Lift the bodice and press the seam again on the right side of the fabric. Steam the gathers to help them settle naturally into shape and drape. Turn the dress inside out and press the 1 cm or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance towards the wrong side of the fabric. Using a 23 cm or 9-inch invisible zip, align the right side of the invisible zipper with the right side of the seam allowance and pin it into place. I've used a cream coloured fabric just to place inside the gap, so this is clearer for you to see. Replace your standard sewing machine foot with a zipper foot. Attach the invisible zipper to the dress by stitching as close to the zipper teeth as possible, folding them aside as you sew. Move the zipper foot to the opposite side to sew the other side of the invisible zipper. Once you've sewn down to the zipper pull, stop and raise the zipper. Then continue stitching below the zipper pull to complete the seam. Head over to your ironing board and press the seams well. Fold the hem of the skirt upwards by 1 cm or 3/8 of an inch towards the wrong side of the fabric and press in place. Stitch 0.3 cm or 1/8 of an inch from the folded edge. Trim off the remaining hem allowance by trimming as close to the stitching as possible. Turn the hem up by another 1 cm or 3/8 of an inch and press in place. Create another line of stitching 0.3 cm or 1/8 of an inch from the folded edge. Finally, press the seam. Place the two strap pieces on top of one another with the right sides together. Stitch the long sides together with a 1 cm or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Press the seams open and then closed. Then trim off 0.5 cm or 0.2 inches of seam allowance. Attach a safety pin to a single layer of fabric and feed the fabric right side out. A loop turner can also be used to pull the fabric through. Once the fabric's been pulled to the right side, press the seams well. At each end of the strap, fold each layer of fabric to the inside wrong side of the strap by 1 centimetre or 3/8 of an inch, and stitch down with a 0.3 centimetre or 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. Press the seams well. I really hope you enjoyed this tutorial. Please message me via Instagram or Etsy if you have any questions. And of course, tag me in your makes on Instagram as I love seeing your unique versions. Hit the subscribe button below if you want to follow along for more sewing content.